The question no one wants to ask is always the most dangerous one. What if the most devastating part of this story isn't how they died, but what happened just hours before? Because on the surface, everything looked perfect. Laughter, music, familiar faces wrapped in holiday cheer. A warm house glowing against the winter night. The kind of evening that makes you believe some families really do escape the fractures everyone else lives with. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people learn too late. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The loudest explosions don't happen in public. They happen after the doors close, when the smiles are gone, when the audience leaves. And that's where this story begins. Not with sirens, not with headlines, not even with death. It begins with a party. A holiday gathering filled with industry veterans, old friends, inside jokes, and carefully rehearsed small talk. To anyone watching from across the room, the older couple at the center of it all looked exactly how you'd expect them to look. Familiar, steady, almost timeless. But if you leaned in a little closer, you might have noticed something else. A pause that lingered too long. A glance that didn't quite land. A silence where warmth should have been. Have you ever been in a room where everything feels fine, but something underneath is clearly not? That was the night. Because what no one at that party knew, what no one could have known, was that this would be the last time anyone would see them alive. And the hours that followed would unravel a story so heavy, so emotionally tangled, that even the people tasked with reconstructing it would struggle to keep their footing. Here's what makes this case different. It wasn't chaos that raised the first alarm. It was absence. A quiet house. A morning that didn't unfold the way it was supposed to. A daughter arriving with no expectation of disaster, only to find her entire world permanently altered. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's slow this down. Because the real story isn't just what happened inside that house. It's what happened before, and what wasn't said. The fictional filmmaker at the center of this story had spent decades crafting narratives for the world. Stories with clean arcs, clear villains, neat resolutions. But his own life? That story was messy, eh? Long marriages always are. People love to imagine that longevity equals harmony. That if two people stay together long enough, the hard parts simply disappear. But anyone who's lived long enough knows the opposite is true. Time doesn't erase conflict. It preserves it, layers it, turns small fractures into fault lines. And according to those who knew this family well, or at least thought they did, there had been tension simmering for years. Not explosive tension, the quiet kind, the kind that settles into routines, the kind you stop talking about because it feels too late to fix, the kind that waits for the wrong moment to surface. That night, something cracked. Not publicly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough that when the couple left the party and disappeared into the dark stretch of road leading home, they weren't just carrying leftovers and goodbyes with them. They were carrying unresolved arguments, old disappointments, and one conversation that had been circling for far too long. Let me ask you something. Have you ever postponed a hard conversation because the timing felt wrong, only to realize later there was never going to be a right time? That's the danger. Because postponement doesn't neutralize tension. It concentrates it. And sometime after midnight, in the early hours when exhaustion strips away politeness, that tension finally surfaced. We don't know every word that was said. We never will. But we do know this. The argument wasn't about one thing. It never is. It was about years. About expectations that went unmet. About choices that couldn't be undone. About a son who stood at the center of more strain than anyone wanted to admit. And here's where the story takes its first truly unsettling turn. Because this wasn't a family argument fueled by rage. It was fueled by disappointment. That's far more dangerous. Disappointment carries memory. It carries history. It carries comparison. It doesn't explode immediately. It tightens. And according to a fictional lifelong family friend, someone who would later come forward in shock and disbelief, voices were raised that night in a way they rarely had been before. Not screaming. Sharper than that. Measured. Controlled. Cutting. The kind of argument where every sentence lands exactly where it's meant to. Have you ever noticed how the calmest arguments often do the most damage? Because they mean the speaker has been rehearsing. By the time the house went quiet again, nothing had been resolved. Just deferred. Just buried under the assumption that morning would soften everything. Morning has a way of betraying that assumption. Because when dawn came, the house didn't wake up. No lights, no movement, no routine sounds. And when their daughter arrived later that morning, she wasn't walking into a crime scene. She was walking into silence. A silence so complete it felt wrong. The kind of silence that doesn't echo. It presses. What she found inside would fracture her life into a before and an after. But even that moment, as shocking as it was, wasn't the moment investigators would later point to as the most disturbing. That came later, when the official findings began to arrive, when professionals trained to remain detached found themselves pausing mid-report. Because the autopsy didn't just explain how two people died. It exposed something far more haunting. That whatever happened inside that house wasn't sudden. It wasn't chaotic. And it wasn't random. And as detectives began reconstructing the final hours, minute by minute, choice by choice, one uncomfortable realization kept resurfacing. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was the final chapter of a story that had been building for a very long time. But the detail that would truly change everything? That detail didn't come from the scene itself. It came from a single line buried inside the autopsy report. A line so clinical, so detached, that its emotional weight almost went unnoticed at first. Almost. And once investigators understood what that line actually meant, they stopped asking who did this and started asking something far more unsettling. Why did it unfold the way it did? Picking up exactly from where we left off. Why did it unfold the way it did? That question haunted the room long after the paperwork was filed and the doors were closed. Because on paper, everything looked straightforward. Two lives ended inside their own home. A quiet neighborhood. No signs of forced entry. No random chaos spilling outward. But reality doesn't live on paper. Reality lives in patterns. And the pattern here didn't match panic. It matched something slower, heavier, deliberate. Investigators are trained to ignore emotion, but even the most seasoned professionals will tell you this. Sometimes a scene feels wrong before you can explain why. This was one of those times. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Furniture undisturbed. No frantic signs of struggle spreading from room to room. No evidence of a sudden intrusion that shattered the space. Instead, everything suggested containment, as if whatever happened stayed tightly confined within the walls of the family dynamic itself. Have you ever walked into a room after a fight and felt the tension still hanging in the air, even though the people were gone? Multiply that feeling by 100. That's what responders described later, in careful language stripped of emotion but heavy with implication. And that's when attention shifted backward, away from the house, away from the moment of discovery, back toward the final hours everyone had initially overlooked. The party, the argument, the drive home. Because something about that sequence refused to sit quietly. The holiday gathering had been warm, yes, but it had also been revealing in ways no one recognized at the time. Friends recalled small details later, details that felt meaningless until hindsight sharpened them. A forced laugh that came a beat too late. A hand placed on an arm, then quickly withdrawn. A moment where the couple seemed to be discussing something urgent while smiling for someone else nearby. You know that feeling when a conversation has two layers? One for the room, one just for the people involved. That was the energy. And according to the fictional family friend who would later speak to investigators, the tension didn't begin at home. It followed them there. This wasn't an argument that exploded out of nowhere in the middle of the night. It was already alive when they walked through the front door. That's a crucial difference. Because spontaneous arguments burn hot and fast. This one smoldered. It carried history. It carried resentment that had been carefully managed for years, managed well enough that most people never noticed it, until it finally slipped. And at the center of that tension stood their son, not as a villain, not as a caricature, but as a mirror, someone whose choices reflected back the fears his parents tried hardest not to face. Expectations unmet, paths diverged, conversations postponed until postponement itself became the problem. Have you ever realized too late that avoiding a topic didn't make it go away? It just made it sharper when it finally surfaced? That's what those final hours were made of. Not rage. Regret. Regret sounds quiet, but it's relentless. It circles. It repeats. It refuses to stay buried. By the time the house settled into silence again, nothing had been resolved. And that silence, the one that followed the argument, was not peaceful. It was heavy. Morning came, but it brought no relief. No routine sounds drifting through the neighborhood. No movement behind the windows. Just stillness. When their daughter arrived, she didn't sense danger immediately. She sensed absence. A wrongness she couldn't explain. The kind that makes you pause before opening a door. That discovery would later be described as the moment time stopped. But what followed would stretch time in a different way, pulling the past into the present with unforgiving clarity. Because once investigators moved beyond the shock and into reconstruction, they began to see the final hours as a chain, one link leading inevitably to the next. In the autopsy report, the document everyone assumes exists only to confirm death, quietly revealed something far more unsettling. It suggested restraint, not hesitation. Restraint. That distinction mattered. It implied control. It implied proximity. It implied familiarity. And suddenly, the story stopped being about a crime scene and became about a family. That shift changed everything. Because once you frame the question that way, you're no longer asking how something happened. You're asking why no one stopped it. And that question doesn't just haunt investigators. It haunts everyone left behind. Why didn't anyone stop it? That question doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't ask permission. It barges in and refuses to leave. Because once investigators accepted that this was not a random act, not an intrusion from the outside, the entire narrative shifted inward, toward history, toward relationships, toward moments that seemed insignificant at the time but now felt unbearably loud. This wasn't a mystery that could be solved by dusting for fingerprints alone. It required something far more uncomfortable, looking backward at a family's emotional architecture, the structure that holds people together until it doesn't. Every family has pressure points, places you avoid touching because you know what happens if you do, topics that get redirected, jokes that disguise discomfort. From the outside, this family looked solid, respected, accomplished, protected by the illusion that success insulates people from collapse. But success doesn't insulate. It amplifies. It raises expectations. It sharpens disappointment. It turns private failures into unspoken shame. And in this house, shame didn't scream. It whispered. That whisper had been growing louder for years. Friends would later describe a household where conversations stayed polite but distant, where love existed, but tension sat beside it like an uninvited guest no one acknowledged. You've seen it before. The family dinner where everyone talks about surface-level things. The smiles that come out automatically. The sense that something important is never addressed because addressing it might break what little piece remains. That's not harmony. That's avoidance. And avoidance has a shelf life. By the time investigators reached this conclusion, the initial shock had faded into something colder. Clarity. They began mapping the final night not as isolated events, but as the inevitable result of a pattern that had been repeating itself for decades. The party wasn't the beginning. It was the last performance. A final moment where everyone played their role. The successful parents. The supportive friends. The family that had figured it out. But the moment they stepped away from that environment, the performance ended. What followed wasn't sudden. It was overdue. And that's what made the autopsy findings so unsettling. Not because of what they described, but because of what they implied. This wasn't chaos. It was control giving way. And when control breaks, the damage is often surgical, precise, emotionally targeted. Have you ever noticed how the people closest to us know exactly where to hurt us, even when they don't mean to? That knowledge doesn't disappear during conflict. It becomes weaponized. Investigators began to realize that the argument that night wasn't about one decision or one mistake. It was about identity, about disappointment crystallizing into confrontation, about parents realizing that the future they imagined had quietly slipped away, and they didn't know how to grieve it without assigning blame, and about a son who felt perpetually measured against expectations he could never meet. That dynamic is more dangerous than anger, because anger burns out. Disappointment lingers. It replays itself in the mind until it demands release. When morning came and silence remained, it wasn't just the absence of life that felt wrong. It was the absence of closure. There was no final resolution. No softened words exchanged before sleep. No repair. Just a night that ended unfinished. And that unfinished quality echoed through every step of the investigation. Through every interview. Every timeline reconstruction. Every forensic conclusion. Even the professionals tasked with remaining neutral found themselves circling back to the same realization. This tragedy wasn't just the result of a single moment. It was the collapse of years of emotional deferral. That's why the autopsy report mattered so much. Not because it provided shocking details, but because it forced everyone to confront the truth that something had been unfolding long before that night. The report didn't introduce violence into the story. It confirmed intent. And intent is where narratives become unbearable. Because intent means choices. Choices made not in panic, but in context. As investigators continued their work, they began asking the kinds of questions families dread. Who knew about the tension? Who noticed the signs? Who assumed things would eventually resolve on their own? Because everyone assumes that. That tomorrow will bring clarity. That morning will cool tempers. That time will do the work we're afraid to do ourselves. But time doesn't heal avoided conversations. It hardens them. And in this case, time ran out. By the time the house was sealed and the official ruling prepared, one thing was painfully clear. This wasn't a mystery built on missing information. It was a tragedy built on too much history. And that history was about to come under scrutiny in ways no one in the family was prepared for. Because the investigation was no longer focused on what happened inside the house. It was focused on what happened inside the family. And the next phase would pull every unresolved moment into the light. Conversations once dismissed as private, arguments minimized as normal family stuff, tensions brushed off as temporary. All of it mattered now. And once that door opened, there would be no way to close it again. Because the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in pieces. And the next piece investigators uncovered would force them to revisit the argument that night, not as a disagreement, but as a warning, one that everyone missed. And what they realized next would change how this story was understood forever. What if the night everyone remembers for its laughter was actually the final act of a much longer performance? Because when people later tried to pinpoint the moment everything went wrong, their instincts betrayed them. They looked for raised voices, for dramatic exits, for visible cracks. They found none. That's the danger of polished rooms and familiar faces. They teach us to trust appearances. The holiday party unfolded exactly the way these gatherings always do. Soft lighting, carefully chosen music, conversations looping through familiar territory, projects, memories, shared jokes polished smooth by repetition. It was the kind of night designed to reassure everyone involved that things were stable, predictable, safe. And the couple at the center of the room played their roles flawlessly. They greeted friends with ease, smiled on cue, accepted compliments with the kind of practiced humility that comes from years in the public eye. To anyone watching, they looked united, comfortable, at peace. But here's the contradiction no one noticed at the time. Peace doesn't require effort. Performance does. And this night required effort. Those closest to them would later recall tiny moments that didn't register as important until hindsight sharpened their edges. A smile that faded a second too early. A hand that didn't reach back when it usually would. A conversation abruptly redirected when it drifted too close to something real. Have you ever replayed a memory after everything fell apart and thought, how did I miss that? That's what this chapter is built on. Missed signals. Because beneath the surface of casual conversation, something else was happening. A negotiation. A careful avoidance of topics that had become dangerous territory within the family. The son arrived later than expected. That detail matters more than people realize. Late arrivals change energy. They interrupt rhythm. They force people to recalibrate expectations. When he walked in, the room adjusted itself around him. Conversations shifted. Attention flickered and then dispersed. Nothing overt. Nothing dramatic. But enough. Enough that someone watching closely would have noticed how his parents reacted. Not with anger, not with relief, but with something harder to define. Assessment. As if they were measuring something invisible. Success? Stability? Distance? No one asked questions directly. They never did. Instead, the evening continued. Drinks refilled. Stories retold. The kind of social lubrication that smooths edges without ever addressing the core. But tension doesn't disappear just because you surround it with noise. It waits. At one point in the evening, a guest made an offhand comment. That the future everyone had been pretending still existed didn't. When that realization settles in, it doesn't scream. It sinks. And what followed would make investigators question everything they thought they understood about the final hours inside that house. Because when the night finally went quiet again, it wasn't because the conflict had ended. It was because something else had begun. And the next morning would expose just how catastrophic that shift had been. Arguments don't actually begin when voices rise. They begin when silence stops being safe. That was the moment the house crossed into unfamiliar territory. The door had closed. The outside world receded. The familiar hum of public life vanished, leaving only 3 people and everything they'd spent years carefully avoiding. The house was still warm from the day. Lamps cast soft pools of light across the rooms. Nothing looked different, and that's what made it dangerous. Because when surroundings remain unchanged, we convince ourselves nothing else has changed either. But something had. The drive home had stripped away distractions. No more laughter filtering in from other rooms. No polite interruptions. No witnesses. Just the slow realization that the conversation they'd postponed all evening was now unavoidable. It started small. A remark about the party. A comment about how late it ran. An observation that sounded harmless on the surface. But beneath it sat years of unsorted emotion. Have you ever noticed how people use small talk to test the temperature before they say what they actually mean? That's what was happening. One sentence at a time, they edged closer to the fault line. The son stood near the entryway, keys still in hand, jacket not yet removed. That detail mattered later. It suggested hesitation, as if some part of him hadn't fully committed to staying. His parents moved deeper into the house, gravitating toward familiar spaces. The kitchen, the living room, rooms where so many other conversations had happened before. That physical separation, subtle, unspoken, mirrored something emotional that had been growing for years. Distance doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just appears. The first real shift came when someone said something they didn't intend to sound accusatory, but did. That's the danger of long history. Words carry weight far beyond their definitions. A suggestion turned into an implication. An explanation sounded like a defense. A question felt like an interrogation. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about the party anymore. It was about direction, about choices, about whether the life unfolding matched the life imagined. That's when the son finally set his keys down. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Small noises do that in tense rooms. Have you ever noticed how silence amplifies everything? Footsteps, breathing, the clink of glass on a countertop. It all feels sharper. The parents sat. The son remained standing. That mattered too. Standing keeps you ready. Sitting settles you. The imbalance wasn't intentional, but it shaped everything that followed. The conversation turned toward the future. Or rather, toward the version of the future that had once been assumed. Expectations that had never been formally agreed upon. Paths that diverged quietly until divergence itself became undeniable. This wasn't about blame. Not yet. It was about disappointment finally finding language. Disappointment is tricky. It often disguises itself as concern. And concern, when repeated too often, can feel like control. The son responded carefully at first. Measured. Polite. But politeness has limits. And when someone feels perpetually evaluated, even gentle questions begin to feel invasive. Have you ever felt like you were constantly being assessed, even by people who loved you? That feeling builds resentment faster than anger ever could. The conversation looped. Past choices resurfaced. Old promises were referenced. Moments that had seemed resolved years ago suddenly felt unfinished again. The parents spoke from fear. Fear that time was running out. Fear that something essential had been missed. Fear that they no longer understood the person standing in front of them. Fear often masquerades as authority. The son heard it as judgment. That's how misunderstandings calcify. No one raised their voice. No one slammed a door. That detail would later confuse people trying to imagine the scene. But calm arguments aren't calm internally. They're tight, compressed. Every word chosen carefully, sharpened by restraint. At one point, the son laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes laughter is the last defense before anger. It landed badly. The room went still. That's when the conversation shifted from strained to fragile. Because once laughter fails, there's nowhere left to hide. The parents pressed on, not aggressively, but persistently. They believed they were helping. That belief mattered. People rarely see themselves as the villain in their own story. They see themselves as the voice of reason. The son's responses grew shorter, less explanatory, more clipped. That's another warning sign people often miss. When someone stops explaining themselves, it's not because they have nothing to say. It's because they've decided it won't matter. Have you ever reached that point in an argument? That moment when you realize understanding isn't actually the goal anymore? That's when things become dangerous. Because resolution requires mutual investment. Withdrawal does not. At some point, no one would ever agree exactly when the argument moved. Not physically, but emotionally. From conversation to confrontation. Still quiet. Still controlled. But no longer collaborative. The son finally said something he'd been holding back for years. Something honest. Something that couldn't be unsaid. It reframed the entire dynamic. It suggested that the disappointment everyone thought they were managing had already done damage. And that damage wasn't reversible. The parents reacted instinctively. One leaned forward. The other shook their head slowly. Those gestures carried more meaning than any words. Disbelief. Denial. Grief. Because when parents realize they've lost influence, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like failure. And failure is hard to accept quietly. The conversation spiraled. Not outward. Inward. Each sentence tightened the space between them while simultaneously widening the emotional distance. That paradox is brutal. You can be inches apart and feel miles away. By the time exhaustion crept in, no one had won. No one had softened. They were simply depleted. The son turned away first. That mattered. Turning away doesn't end an argument. It pauses it. He moved toward the hallway, toward the space he always retreated to when things became overwhelming. Retreat is not escape. It's postponement. And postponement doesn't erase tension. It concentrates it. The parents remained where they were, sitting in the aftershock of everything that had just been said. Silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried weight. It carried consequence. The house settled. Lights dimmed. Doors closed. The night deepened. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. No raised voices carried through the neighborhood. No visible disturbance. No reason for concern. That's the part people struggle with later. How something so catastrophic could unfold so quietly. But quiet doesn't mean safe. Quiet means contained. And containment, when it fails, fails completely. As the early hours crept closer to morning, something irreversible was already in motion. Not because of a single decision, but because of every decision that had led to this moment. And when investigators later reconstructed the timeline, one detail kept resurfacing as the most haunting of all. Not what was said, not what was done, but what wasn't resolved before everyone went their separate ways inside that house. Because unresolved conflict doesn't sleep. It waits. And what happened next would force everyone involved to confront just how dangerous waiting can be. Continuing exactly from where we left off. Waiting is deceptive. It looks passive. It feels temporary. But waiting is often when decisions are made, quietly, internally, without witnesses. The house had gone still, but nothing inside it had settled. In the hallway, the son paused outside his room longer than usual. His hand rested on the doorframe, not opening it, not closing anything behind him, just standing there, as if he were listening, as if part of him expected someone to call his name, to soften the night, to pull the conversation back from the edge it had reached. No one did. Down the hall, his parents sat in silence that felt heavier than the argument itself. They didn't speak to each other right away. That's another detail people misunderstand. Silence between two people who have shared decades together isn't empty. It's crowded with memory, with shared disappointment, with a mutual awareness that something fundamental has shifted. One of them finally stood, not abruptly, carefully. That care suggested fatigue rather than anger, the kind that seeps into the body after emotional exertion. They moved through the house performing small, familiar tasks, straightening a cushion, turning off a lamp. Habits learned over years, now serving as anchors in a moment that felt unmoored. Have you ever noticed how people cling to routine when everything else feels unstable? Routine gives the illusion of control, but illusion can only hold for so long. In his room, the son sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. Darkness has a way of sharpening thought. It removes distractions, forces reflection. His mind replayed the conversation. Not the whole thing, just the moments that landed hardest. The pause before an answer. The look exchanged between his parents. The implication he hadn't been able to shake. That he was a disappointment they'd grown tired of explaining away. That realization stung not because it was new, but because it felt confirmed. There's a difference between suspecting something and hearing it echoed in the way people speak to you. Suspicion hurts. Confirmation wounds. Down the hall, his parents weren't sleeping either. They lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the same exchange from an entirely different angle. Not as criticism, as concern. That disconnect mattered, because both sides believe they were right. And when everyone believes they're acting out of care, no one feels responsible for the damage being done. Time passed unevenly. Minutes stretched. Thoughts spiraled. Regret crept in, but not regret for the conversation. Regret for the timing. Why tonight? Why now? Why when everyone was already exhausted? Those questions arrived too late. Eventually, someone moved again. Footsteps, quiet against the floor. That sound would later become one of the most analyzed moments of the night. Not because it was loud, because it was deliberate. The son stepped back into the hallway. Not storming, not pacing, just walking. Have you ever felt compelled to say something even when you know it might make things worse? That's the pull of unfinished conversations. They don't let you rest. He stopped near the living room. The light was dim. Shadows softened the edges of familiar furniture. One parent sat upright, awake, alert. Their eyes met. That moment, brief, silent, held more weight than the argument itself, because it carried a question neither of them voiced. Do we continue this? The son spoke first. His voice was calm. Too calm. That kind of calm isn't peace. It's resolve. He clarified something he felt had been misunderstood. Or maybe he corrected something he'd been carrying for years. The words themselves would later blur in retellings. But the intent did not. He wasn't asking permission anymore. He was stating a boundary. Boundaries are healthy, but they're also threatening to people who aren't ready to accept them. The parent responded slowly, measured. They chose their words carefully, which only made them sharper. Concern framed as inevitability. Advice framed as warning. It landed badly. The son's posture shifted. Not aggressive. Defensive. That's another signal investigators would later note. Defensiveness doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from feeling cornered. The second parent entered the room quietly. Not to escalate. To mediate. Or so they believed. But mediation requires neutrality. And neutrality is difficult when fear is involved. The conversation tightened again. Not louder. Closer. Each sentence narrowing the space for misunderstanding while increasing emotional pressure. At some point, the son shook his head. That simple gesture carried finality. He stepped back. And this time, he didn't wait. He turned away. That's the moment everyone would later fixate on. The last visible choice. The parents remained standing where they were. Stunned not by anger, but by realization. That they had reached a limit they hadn't recognized before. That the authority they assumed they still held had quietly expired. And that expiration hurt. More than they expected. The house returned to silence once more. But now it was a fractured silence. The kind that follows impact. No one slept. Time crawled toward morning. And in those early hours, something shifted again. Not emotionally. Practically. A door opened. Footsteps moved through the house. A routine motion performed without thought. Or perhaps with too much of it. From the outside, the house remained still. Inside, everything was changing. When investigators later reconstructed these hours, they struggled with one central question. Why didn't anyone leave? Why didn't someone step outside, take a breath, create distance? The answer isn't simple. Because leaving feels like escalation when you've spent a lifetime staying. Staying becomes reflex, and reflex overrides reason. By the time dawn approached, the house held more than silence. It held consequence. And when the morning finally arrived, it would reveal just how much had been set in emotion while everyone waited for things to calm down on their own. Because they never did. And the discovery that followed would force investigators to confront a chilling truth. Whatever happened next wasn't the result of a sudden snap. It was the result of everything that had already happened. And once that realization set in, there was no turning back. Morning has a way of exposing what the night tried to hide. It doesn't arrive gently after nights like this. It creeps in, unwelcome, illuminating the damage left behind by hours of unresolved tension. Inside the house, dawn didn't bring clarity. It brought stillness. The kind of stillness that feels wrong because it's too complete. No footsteps moving from room to room. No familiar sounds marking the start of the day. No ordinary rhythms easing everyone back into routine. Routine never got the chance. When investigators later talked about that morning, they described it as frozen, a moment suspended in time, as if the house itself hesitated before revealing what had happened inside it. But before any of that, there was waiting. The daughter arrived later that morning, expecting nothing more than an ordinary visit. She'd been there countless times before. She knew the layout by heart, the way the light filtered through the windows at that hour. The quiet hum of a place lived in for decades. Something felt off immediately. Not danger. Absence. Have you ever walked into a space you know well and felt it was missing something essential, even before you can identify what? That's what stopped her at the threshold. The house didn't greet her. No voices. No movement. No sign of life unfolding the way it always had. She called out. Nothing. Each step forward deepened the unease. Familiar rooms felt altered, not because they looked different, but because they felt hollow. What she found would permanently divide her life into two parts. Before and after. The discovery itself wasn't loud. There was no dramatic crash. No scream echoing through the house. Just the sudden, undeniable understanding that something irreversible had happened. From that moment on, nothing moved quickly. Shock slows time. Every action felt deliberate, careful, unreal. Emergency calls were made. Help arrived. The house filled with people who didn't belong there. Uniforms, equipment, voices speaking in measured tones. But the damage was already done. When investigators entered the scene, they weren't met with chaos. They were met with order. And that disturbed them. No signs of frantic movement throughout the house. No overturned furniture. No indication of a struggle spilling from one room into another. Instead, the scene suggested containment, intent. And that realization immediately reframed the investigation. Because crimes of panic leave mess. Crimes of intention leave precision. That's when the night before became more than background. It became context. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline backward, starting not with the discovery, but with the last confirmed moments the family had been together. The party, the drive home, the argument. Every detail suddenly mattered. Who spoke to whom? Who left the room first? Who stayed awake? These weren't casual questions. They were essential, because something about the sequence didn't align with accident or intrusion. It aligned with familiarity, with proximity, with people who knew the house well enough to move through it quietly. As hours passed, and the initial shock settled into procedure, the autopsy process began. Not as spectacle, as confirmation. And while the findings would later be described in careful, clinical language, their implications were anything but clinical. They pointed to control, to proximity, to a lack of randomness that unsettled everyone who read them. But here's the part that rarely gets discussed. Autopsy reports don't just describe what happened to bodies. They describe timing. They speak to sequence. They suggest what happened first and what followed. And as investigators studied the report, one thing became clear. This wasn't an event that unfolded in a single, explosive moment. It unfolded in stages, which meant there were opportunities for it to stop. That realization cast the night before in an even harsher light. The argument wasn't just a conflict. It was a prelude. And when investigators returned to the son's movements that night, his pauses, his returns to shared spaces, the moments of hesitation, those details took on a new gravity. This wasn't about assigning blame yet. It was about understanding momentum, how emotion builds, how restraint fractures, how silence can be mistaken for resolution. The house had become a pressure chamber. And pressure chambers don't fail gradually. They fail all at once. As the day wore on, questions multiplied. Why did no one leave the house after the argument? Why did everyone retreat instead of creating distance? Why did familiarity override caution? The answers weren't satisfying, because they were human. People stay because leaving feels like surrender. People stay because walking away feels permanent. People stay because they believe things will cool down if given time. But time doesn't always cool things down. Sometimes it crystallizes them. By the time the sun fully rose, the story had already shifted from tragedy to investigation, from loss to scrutiny. Time implies opportunity. That's the part that haunted everyone involved. Because opportunity means there were moments where something else could have happened instead. A door could have opened. A conversation could have paused. Distance could have been created. But none of that occurred. Why? The answer investigators kept returning to wasn't violence. It was familiarity. Familiarity breeds comfort. Comfort breeds assumption. Assumption breeds risk. When people have lived together for years, even decades, they stop perceiving each other as potential sources of harm. That perception doesn't change just because tension escalates. And that's what made the final hours so deceptive. Nothing felt dangerous enough to flee. Nothing felt urgent enough to interrupt. Until it was too late. As the investigation continued, attention inevitably turned toward the son. Not because of accusation. Because of proximity. He was there. He had been part of the argument. His emotional state had been visibly affected. Those facts alone placed him at the center of inquiry. And that pressure, subtle at first, began to alter how the story was being told. Every statement was weighed. Every pause examined. Every choice scrutinized. Not to assign guilt prematurely, but to understand motive. And motive doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Like resignation. Like the belief that nothing you say will ever change how you're seen. That belief is dangerous. Because when people stop believing they can be understood, they stop communicating. They act. The house itself became a silent witness. Investigators walked its rooms again and again, tracing paths taken in the dark hours before dawn. They noted what wasn't disturbed, what remained in place, what suggested familiarity rather than intrusion. No forced entry, no signs of an outsider, no evidence of randomness. Every conclusion pointed back toward intimacy, toward people who knew each other well enough to move quietly, to act deliberately, to hesitate. And hesitation mattered, because hesitation suggests internal conflict. And internal conflict suggests awareness. As the day wore on, the family's reality fractured further. Public sympathy poured in. Private questions intensified. Friends struggled to reconcile the image they had known with the implications unfolding behind closed doors. How could something like this happen in a family that seemed so stable? That question haunted everyone. But stability is not the same as health. Stability can be maintained through silence. And silence, when stretched too far, becomes structural failure. By the end of that first day, investigators had reached a quiet consensus. This was not a story of sudden violence. It was a story of accumulated strain, of conversations deferred until they became unavoidable, of expectations never renegotiated, of love existing alongside resentment without resolution. And that made the next phase of the investigation inevitable. Because once emotional context is established, the search for responsibility begins. Not just legal responsibility, emotional responsibility. Who knew what? Who sensed the warning signs? Who believed things would calm down if given time? Those questions would follow everyone involved for the rest of their lives. And the son, now under intense scrutiny, would soon realize that the argument everyone wanted to downplay was about to be dissected in ways he never imagined. Because investigators weren't finished with that night. Not even close. The next chapter of this story would take that argument apart piece by piece, not to relive it, but to understand how a single evening could carry the weight of an entire family's history. And when that examination began, one detail would surface that reframed everything yet again. A detail so small it had initially been dismissed. But once noticed, it could no longer be ignored. A pause. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that demands attention. Just a moment where someone stopped speaking and didn't start again right away. Investigators call these moments breaks in flow. They matter because they reveal hesitation. And hesitation reveals conflict. The pause came during one of the earliest interviews, when the son was asked to walk through the argument again. Not the whole thing, just the beginning. Where did it start? He answered quickly at first. Too quickly. Rehearsed. Clean. The kind of response that suggests someone has already told themselves a version of events they can live with. But when the interviewer asked to follow up, a simple clarification, that's when the pause appeared. Silence filled the room. Not long enough to be suspicious on its own. Long enough to be noticeable. Have you ever been asked a question you thought you were prepared for, only to realize the honest answer was heavier than expected? That's what that pause suggested. When he continued, his explanation shifted slightly. Not in substance, in framing. The argument, he said, was misunderstood. It had been taken out of proportion. Emotions were high. Those phrases are familiar. They're the language of minimization, not denial. Reduction. And reduction often signals something people aren't ready to confront directly. Investigators didn't interrupt. They rarely do. They let silence do the work. As the interview progressed, the story of that night became less linear and more emotional. He spoke about pressure, about expectations, about feeling watched even when nothing was being said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appear angry. If anything, he sounded tired. Exhaustion has a tone. It flattens inflection, drains urgency, turns frustration into something quieter and more dangerous. That tone caught the interviewer's attention, because rage burns hot, but fatigue burns long. The son described years of trying to prove something, though he struggled to articulate exactly what. Approval? Autonomy? Worth? The answer seemed to shift depending on the moment. And that inconsistency wasn't seen as deception. It was seen as confusion. People who feel perpetually measured often don't know what standard they're failing anymore. They just know they are. As he spoke, one contradiction became increasingly clear. He claimed the argument hadn't been serious, yet he described it in detail. He insisted it wasn't different from past disagreements, yet he acknowledged it felt final in some way. Those two things couldn't coexist easily, and investigators noticed. They asked about the moment he turned away, the moment he returned to the hallway, the moment he came back into the room later. That's when his answers grew more careful, not evasive. Careful. He explained that he hadn't intended to continue the argument. He just wanted to clarify something, to correct a misunderstanding. That word came up again. Misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't usually carry the emotional weight described in the autopsy timeline. Misunderstandings resolve. This didn't. When pressed gently about why he didn't leave the house after that second exchange, he hesitated again. Another pause. This one longer. Finally, he answered with something disarmingly honest. Because it was late. Because it was his home. Because leaving felt like admitting something had broken. That answer landed heavily. Not because it was incriminating. Because it was human. People rarely leave when things feel fragile. They stay and hope proximity will somehow fix what conversation couldn't. Investigators noted something else during that interview. The son didn't talk about anger toward his parents. He talked about disappointment. His own. In himself. He spoke about feeling like he'd failed to become the version of himself they expected. That sense of internal failure matters, because it changes how conflict is experienced. Arguments stop being about disagreement and start being about identity. And identity conflicts don't cool off easily. As the interview continued, one detail surfaced almost accidentally. He mentioned that during the argument, one of his parents had referenced a previous conversation, a conversation from years earlier, one he thought had been resolved. That reference reopened something he believed had been closed. That's when investigators understood something crucial. This argument wasn't just emotional. It was archival. It pulled material from the past and dropped it into the present without warning. Have you ever been blindsided by an old issue you thought was settled? That shock destabilizes people. It redefines the present as unsafe. Because if the past can resurface without warning, nothing ever truly stays resolved. That realization reframed everything. The argument wasn't escalating because of what was being said. It was escalating because of what was being resurrected. Investigators began cross-referencing timelines, past disagreements, periods of estrangement, moments where the family had appeared close again. They noticed a pattern. After each conflict, there had been silence, then normalization, then avoidance. The family had mastered the art of moving forward without repairing anything. That strategy works until it doesn't, because unresolved issues don't dissolve. They accumulate, and accumulation creates pressure. The son's emotional state that night, when viewed through that lens, looked less like a reaction and more like a culmination. Years of small disappointments stacked one atop another. Expectations never renegotiated. Approval always conditional. And when that final conversation dragged an old wound into the open, it didn't feel like concern. It felt like confirmation that nothing had ever really changed. That realization is devastating, because it tells someone their efforts were invisible, their growth unacknowledged, their autonomy unrecognized. And when people reach that conclusion, their behavior shifts. Not explosively, inward. They withdraw. They stop explaining. They stopped believing repair is possible. Investigators returned to the autopsy timeline again. They studied the spacing between events, the gaps, the pauses. Those gaps aligned disturbingly well with moments of emotional withdrawal, periods where nothing outwardly happened, but internal decisions likely did. The son's movements that night were quiet, deliberate, unhurried. That suggested contemplation rather than impulse. And contemplation changes responsibility, because it introduces awareness. The investigators weren't building a case yet. They were building understanding. But understanding can be more damning than accusation. Because once you understand motive, behavior stops feeling random. It starts feeling logical, not justified, logical. And logic makes stories harder to escape. As interviews continued, others close to the family were asked about similar patterns. They described a household where love was present but conditional, where praise was sparse, where expectations were inherited, not negotiated. That environment doesn't produce villains. It produces pressure, and pressure produces fractures. By the end of the day, investigators had stopped asking whether the argument mattered. They knew it did. They were now asking how much it mattered, and whether it crossed a line from emotional conflict into something else. Because one thing was becoming impossible to ignore. The argument didn't end that night. It transformed. And the transformation happened quietly, without witnesses, without raised voices, without interruption, which meant whatever followed was born not out of chaos, but out of clarity. And clarity can be far more dangerous, because clarity convinces people they are right. The next step in the investigation would test that clarity against evidence. Physical, temporal, behavioral. And when those elements were layered together, they would force a question no one was ready to answer. At what point does emotional exhaustion turn into action? And more importantly, who crosses that point first? At what point does a thought stop being a thought? Because that line, the invisible one between contemplation and action, is where everything changes. Investigators understand this better than most. They know that moments of clarity can be far more dangerous than moments of rage. Rage is loud, obvious, predictable. Clarity is quiet. And the quiet that settled over the house in the early hours of that morning was anything but empty. It was dense. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest and forces you to confront what you've been circling for years. In the reconstruction of that night, investigators paid close attention to timing. Not just when things happened, but when nothing happened. Because inactivity can be as revealing as movement. After the second exchange in the living room, the son didn't pace. He didn't shout. He didn't slam doors. He withdrew. Withdrawal is often mistaken for de-escalation. But withdrawal can also be preparation. He returned to his room and sat again, this time longer. The light stayed off. Darkness wrapped the space in anonymity. No reflections. No visual reminders of consequence. Just thought. Have you ever noticed how darkness can make ideas feel heavier, but also clearer? Without visual distraction, the mind sharpens. Investigators later noted that this period, this stretch of quiet, was one of the most critical segments of the timeline, because it was long enough for reflection. And reflection implies choice. Down the hall, his parents had retreated as well. Separate spaces, separate thoughts. The house divided into islands of silence. That division mattered, because silence shared can be stabilizing. Silence alone is isolating. One parent eventually fell asleep. Exhaustion won out. Emotional depletion often leads to physical shutdown. The other did not. That detail would become significant later. Wakefulness extends opportunity. Opportunity invites decision. In the stillness, memories replayed. Not just of that night, but of years. Moments where disappointment was swallowed instead of spoken. Moments where concern replaced acceptance. Moments where love existed, but always under the shadow of expectation. Have you ever realized too late that your version of care felt like pressure to someone else? That realization hurts. But hurt doesn't always lead to apology. Sometimes it leads to defensiveness. Sometimes it leads to doubling down. The night deepened. The house remained still. And then, movement. Not hurried. Not erratic. Measured. Footsteps, soft against the floor, moved from one room into the shared space again. This was not a continuation of the argument. It was something else. Investigators would later describe it as a transition moment. A moment where the emotional state shifted from reactive to resolved. Resolved doesn't mean peaceful. It means decided. What exactly was decided remains one of the most haunting unknowns of this case. But the sequence that followed suggests something fundamental had changed. The house did not erupt into chaos. It narrowed. Spaces became smaller. Interactions more contained. Familiarity guided movement. Doors opened quietly. Paths were chosen with certainty. This wasn't confusion. It was intention. And intention leaves a different kind of trace. When investigators reviewed the autopsy findings alongside the timeline, they noticed something that reinforced this conclusion. There was evidence of progression, not a single overwhelming moment, but stages, which meant time passed, which meant awareness existed. That awareness changed how the entire night was interpreted. Because once awareness enters the picture, the narrative stops being about loss of control. It becomes about the moment control is exercised. The son's emotional state during this period was later described by those who interacted with him afterward as flat. Not distraught, not frantic, flat. That kind of effect often follows internal resolution. When a person decides something they've been resisting, emotional turbulence can give way to calm. That calm is deceptive. It can look like relief. It can look like composure. But it can also be the stillness before irreversible action. Investigators didn't jump to conclusions. They never do. Instead, they layered data, movement, timing, behavior before and after. And as those layers stacked, a troubling picture emerged. This wasn't an event driven by panic. It was driven by accumulation, by a sense that something had reached its endpoint. And endpoints are dangerous because they erase alternatives. When someone believes there are no more options, their behavior shifts dramatically. They stop seeking approval. They stop explaining themselves. They stop waiting. The house bore witness to that shift. Nothing about the environment suggested urgency, which meant urgency existed internally. An internal urgency doesn't need volume. It needs resolve. By the time dawn approached, whatever decision had been made was already set in motion. The night didn't unravel into chaos. It crystallized. And when the first light filtered through the windows, it illuminated the aftermath of something that had been building for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. Investigators would later say that this chapter of the night, the quietest one, was the most important, because it held the moment where everything could still have gone differently, and didn't. The next phase of the investigation would focus on that transition, on the shift from emotion to action, on the precise point where thought became behavior. And when they pinpointed that moment, it would force them to confront an unsettling possibility. That what happened wasn't sudden. It was chosen. That word settled uncomfortably over the investigation like a low fog. Not because it answered questions, but because it raised heavier ones. Choice implies awareness. Awareness implies agency. Agency implies responsibility. Investigators are trained to move carefully once those implications appear. They don't rush. They don't speculate. They let the evidence speak in sequence, because sequence tells a story that emotion cannot obscure. And the sequence here kept pointing back to the same narrow window of time. The hours after the argument. The period of withdrawal. The return to shared space. This was the corridor where everything converged. The house itself became a map, not of rooms, but of decisions. Investigators traced movement patterns slowly, deliberately. Not just where someone went, but how they went there. Were steps hurried or measured? Were paths direct or circuitous? Were doors opened forcefully or quietly? These details might seem insignificant. They're not, because panic is messy. Decision is neat. And everything about this night leaned toward neat. One investigator later described it this way. Nothing felt rushed. That's what scared us. Because when something isn't rushed, it suggests someone felt they had time. Time to think. Time to act. Time to reconsider. Time that wasn't used to stop what was unfolding. The autopsy timeline reinforced this. Not with spectacle, with spacing. Intervals that allowed for pauses. Moments where nothing happened externally, but everything may have happened internally. That spacing mattered more than any single detail, because it contradicted the idea of a sudden break. It suggested something slower, more deliberate. Investigators returned again and again to the emotional temperature of the house. Not heated, pressurized. There's a difference.